I grew up in North London, not far from where my studio is now, and my mother was an artist, a sort of early feminist artist, and my father, he worked in universities and he was a lecturer in humanities. But later on, he became the head of an art school because he was a very good administrator. And also he had an interest in art, with my mother being an artist. So, it kind of worked very well. And he'd always been very interested in human geography. And I think that was quite an influence upon me. And also, my mother was interested in that. So, often with family holidays, they'd, stop, and they'd jump out the car and take a photograph or whatever. So that was always something that I always remember, this kind of, that creativity was always around, whether it was doing watercolours in the landscape or taking photographs in urban places or, just there was a sort of creative attitude in the family, a sort of 70s kind of bohemian London, feel to our family life. Maybe that has something to do with being the parents of sort of post-war children, and that sort of idea of unlike we have now, it was not this, capitalist culture where it's just more and more objects and more things in your home. And, it was very particular what people had. And some of it was very cheap furniture and, things that were made in the sort of utilitarian furniture that was made sort of soon after the war, which was, using far less materials than the kind of solid things that were made, 30 years before that. I had, when I was at art school, my sort of, the main places that I would go to would be the dump and second-hand shops. And that's really something that came from my childhood as well. We used to go to the dump and we'd get our kind of, I remember we picked up a dinner service at the dump, where you'd go through this kind of mountain of rubbish and you'd find these treasures and, and they were made all the more special because that's sort of how you got them. All of those things were partly a kind of influence. But, I think it's a lot to do with, the time in which I grew up and after the, 2 world wars and, there was a sort of change and an optimism and a sort of thoughtfulness, I suppose, about culture and the way we looked at the world. As a child, we had a darkroom at home, and I was fascinated by this darkroom where you would have a negative and you put light through it and you put it on paper and you put it through some chemicals and then you had this black and white photograph. It was like alchemy, it was like kind of magic. And I think for me, it's a sort of similar thing with space and how I realised that, all of these places that were made to be forgotten, so the places underneath beds, underneath chairs, underneath tables, inside wardrobes, these places which were just for storing things or for dust to collect. And, I just found them partly, I suppose, to do with the sort of childhood imagination of the places that you would hide, but also a way of making those things concrete through the casting process. It made you a space and showed you a place that had never really existed before. And there was something about that, I think, that once I, cast the first thing and I looked at it and I just thought, wow, that's really changed. It's kind of the way I look at the world. It was a real sort of eureka moment, actually, and a very special moment, which I remember very clearly. And it sort of started at when I was at Brighton and I did a metal casting course, and I just, I had spoons and I would just press them into sand and then pour in lead or aluminium, and from that you got this object that was a spoon but without its spoonness, so it didn't have the sort of cup in it anymore. It was solid. And the same sort of thing as pouring plaster into a matchbox or something, and you kind of open it up and remove the matchbox and you have this little plaster box. So these things are very, very simple ideas, but once you sort of start to use them and repeat them and make 100 spaces that look the same or similar, or cast a whole house, or these things that are then sort of blown up into a different experience of the world, I think it can become very profound, I suppose. I think, I love materials. I love playing physically with materials, but I also love colour and surface and, the things that traditionally come with painting or printmaking or whatever. And, for me, working with those two things combined, whether it's painting it white and painting it and painting it and painting it, which is, in itself quite a kind of complex process, because I'm not just painting, I'm painting it and filling in things and painting it and then taking something out, and I'm sort of sculpting with the paint in a way. And I think with working with bronze and patinating that, or working with paper and using silver leaf on that, or any of the things that I do, or very, very early on when I just worked with plaster and then would use different sort of things like oil or soap or whatever that would leave different traces on the surface, or ways of picking up dirt from the surface. So it's always something that I've been very conscious of, actually. And even when I was at Brighton, very, very young, doing things, I'd always use different ways of interpreting a material. The process of making things has always been something that's kind of fascinated me, and I've always tried to use the materiality of the material for it to be the sort of finished form in a way. But occasionally that's different. And actually now, because I've started making things more with real things, with using something like corrugated iron, and then painting it and painting it and painting it, it's sort of whiter than white. It's whiter than the plaster. And it does something else. It sort of makes a space, rather than a hole. And yeah, it's just now, I think, as a more mature artist, what's interesting is to really be able to, play with this kind of lexicon of words and lexicon of materials, and yeah, it's like being a magician, having lots of different tricks that you can use and, make a performance from. One of the things that I think really makes people sort of intuit, or gives people a sort of intuition with my work, or whatever you call it, is because of its reality, its sort of attachment to reality. And it feels like things that we see all the time, but they might be slightly different. It feels like a memory that you have. It feels a bit like a dream, or something in a dream that came up. And and they're always the things that I'm trying to work with, is the sort of intangibility of language, and finding ways to use sort of colour or metal, or paper, or using this different way of making these things. And I'm glad I do, because quite frankly I think I'd get really bored. There's artists like Robert Ryman, or who just worked in white for decades, made some beautiful paintings, and and that's what he did. But what I've really tried to do, and it took a long time and confidence, actually, to feel that I could do that. I mean, doing this show that I did at Gagosian, it was really like I put it up and sort of went like that, because I had no idea what people would think, because it was so different to things. And I had great friends over lockdown and I said, can you come and see what I'm doing? Because I just want a reaction. And a curator, a great friend of mine is a curator, and she came in and her face was just like, she just completely, looked like she'd seen a ghost. and I thought, that's good. That's good that someone has no understanding of what this is, that it's just completely come out of somewhere else. And, for me, making Poltergeist was a bit like making Ghost. It felt like it was doing the same thing, hence the title, but it felt like it had got inside Ghost and just gone, and found another way of being angry or being, you know what I mean? Another way of sort of looking at the world, which I think as an artist, that's pretty good. I mean, to be able to do that, find a way of doing that. I've always trawled through my life experience and picked out things that I felt are maybe things that other people have experienced, some sort of communal experience, I think using things like therapy or, where you can start to isolate things and think about things in a slightly different way. All of those things have come into the work sort of over the decades. But, I feel, for me, I think a lot of the memory stuff is something that I kind of can't switch off, and I wish I could actually, because it can kind of bog you down. And, I always think of my mind as being like a filing cabinet that's really kind of overfull now, and I'd actually like to start shredding some of it. But actually, it's quite hard to do that. I've made a number of pieces called shy sculptures, which are, there's one in Norway, there's one in Japan now, there's two in the desert in California. There's, they're beginning to get, what I'm trying to do with them is to sort of make these cast generic buildings all over the world if I can. And it's I see it as a kind of lifelong project. And whenever the opportunity arises, I'll do that. And, over lockdown, we made one in Japan over Zoom. It was kind of extraordinary. And I think there's very few countries that we could have done that in, but the artisans were really on board and meticulous, and that made this fantastic piece that's now sitting in this very kind of remote town in Japan. So, that was a great thing that came out of lockdown for me. What artists do is reflect upon what's happening. And, they're kind of ciphers for helping to sort of understand, I suppose, politically, culturally, physically, what's going on. And if you're lucky, you can make a piece of work that reflects that well and engages people, whether that's a book or a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music or a poem, And I'm a great believer in that we are, we do reflect upon all of these things and make the world a different place and a richer place, actually. Well, I think a lot of the things that I make, the shy sculptures, I think that's something that will remain and be these sort of slightly strange objects that will weather with time, and maybe the plaque that says it's made by Rachel Whiteread will disappear, and people will wonder what it is, or, you know, and maybe excavate inside it and then scratch their heads. And, you know, I mean, who knows what will happen, you know, and there's always museums. I'm very lucky to have a lot of work in museums, you know, over the world. And, you know, and private collectors who often give their work as gifts to museums. You know, I think one of the biggest gifts we can give as an artist is what is given to the next generation, and then the next generation absorb it and think about it and maybe take from it. You know, and that is, you know, will be now through social media and, but, you know, also through books and things that are taught in schools and further education. And yeah, I mean, I think I've got a place in history. I mean, I don't know how big it's going to be, but it's nice to know that there are things that I've made that will always be thought about and, you know, a part of our culture.